In the grand halls of the Pembroke estate, Amelia had spent 12 years invisible, her dreams smothered under the weight of servitude. But when the call came that her father was gone, and her employers refused to let her say goodbye, something inside her shattered. What happens next will change everything, her silence, her loyalty, her very life forever. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Amelia woke up every morning before the first light of dawn. The cold, quiet house felt like a world of its own. As she stood in the small kitchen of the Pembroke estate, she tied her apron with practiced hands, her movements quiet, almost mechanical. The grand chandelier above her head hung still in the half-light, casting fractured reflections onto the marble countertops. She didn't need to look at the clock. Her body had long since memorized the rhythm of this place. She had been here for 12 years, waking up in the dark to prepare breakfast for people who barely knew her name. The estate was vast, its towering walls made of imported European stone. It had 3 floors, and each room had an air of wealth and prestige. The floors were polished to perfection, and the walls lined with oil paintings of pale-faced ancestors who had lived here long before the Pembrokes. The rugs were thick, muffling every sound, as though even footsteps had to be whispered. Amelia moved through these halls like a shadow, always present, but never seen. She adjusted the pillows, straightened the paintings, and made sure everything was perfect before the family came downstairs. She had imagined once that after all these years, there might be some recognition, some acknowledgement of her efforts. Perhaps a warm smile, a thank you, or even a word of appreciation. But as the years passed, those thoughts faded, leaving her with a bitter taste of reality. The Pembrokes were indifferent, as they had always been. To them, she was not Amelia. She was the maid, the girl, the help, nothing more. Her back ached as she set the French press on the table, the kettle whistling softly, steam rising into the air. She had learned to live in silence, to blend into the background, to become invisible. Her hands, now rough from years of work, moved expertly as she poured coffee into the cups, antique porcelain that gleamed under the kitchen lights. She never allowed herself to linger on thoughts of home or the life she had left behind. There was no time for that. The Pembrokes didn't ask her about her day, and she didn't ask about theirs. It was an unspoken rule that had become as natural to her as breathing. By the time the coffee was brewed and the scones reheated, the sun began to rise, casting a soft pink glow through the tall windows. The estate stood still and cold, its grandeur unchanging. It was the same every day, predictable, cold, and indifferent. Amelia moved about with grace, setting the table with precision, making sure every fork, every knife, every napkin was in its place. She had learned how to move silently, how to serve without drawing attention, how to be seen without being noticed. The first to descend was Mrs. Pembroke. Her silk robe swished as she glided into the dining room, her platinum hair perfectly styled, her lips sharp, her smile tighter than the skin stretched across her cheeks. She didn't look at Amelia as she took her seat at the table, but Amelia could feel her eyes flicker in her direction for a brief moment, as if she was just checking to make sure everything was in order. "Warm, not hot," Mrs. Pembroke said, inspecting her coffee with a cold, clinical air. Amelia nodded, pouring just the right amount, stepping back into the shadows, blending into the room like a well-trained stagehand. Belinda and Ashley, the Pembrokes' 2 daughters, came next, both in their 20s, both molded from their mother's image. They wore designer loungewear and carried their phones like scepters. Their laughter filled the room, obnoxious and hollow. They barely noticed Amelia as they discussed their plans for the day, their weekend trips, their latest shopping hauls. "Did you see what Darla wore to the club last night?" Belinda asked, tapping at her phone. "It was tragic." Ashley giggled in response. It looked like something the maid would wear. The word stung, but Amelia had learned long ago not to show any reaction. She simply stood by the wall, waiting in silence as the women continued their conversation. It was always like this, words thrown carelessly, insults disguised as jokes. It was as if she didn't matter at all. But that was the way it had always been. No one noticed the work she did. No one acknowledged the long hours she spent making the Pembrokes' lives perfect. To them, she was nothing more than a fixture of the house, just another part of the background. Amelia cleared the table and carried the dishes to the kitchen. The chef wouldn't arrive for another hour, so she had time to hand-wash the fine china. She scrubbed with quiet precision, her thoughts wandering back to the small town where she had grown up. She hadn't been home in years. Her father, the man who had raised her, had passed away 2 years ago, and she hadn't even been able to attend his funeral. The guilt weighed heavily on her, but she had never been able to find the time to go back. There was always something more pressing. Always another task to complete. Always another demand to meet. As the hours passed, Amelia moved through the house like a ghost, polishing silver, vacuuming the rugs, fluffing the down pillows in the guest bedrooms. There were no breaks, no pauses, only the endless cycle of chores that filled her days. The Pembrokes didn't care about her. They never asked how she was feeling, never checked to see if she was okay. They simply expected her to do her job, to serve them without question, without complaint. And she did, every day without fail. When dinner came, Amelia served it in silence. She moved between the courses, refilling glasses, retrieving plates, responding to gestures rather than words. Her hands trembled slightly under the weight of the silver tray, but she steadied herself. She had served the Pembrokes for more than a decade, and yet they barely glanced at her. She wasn't a person to them. She was just a tool, something that could be used and discarded when no longer needed. After dinner, she returned to her small room in the servants' wing. It was a narrow space with a cot, a nightstand, and a single window. She sat on the edge of the bed, her swollen feet aching, her back screaming with pain. She opened the drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a photograph of her father, worn and creased at the edges. It was the last photo they had taken together, just before she had left for the city, chasing a life she thought would be better than the one she had. She hadn't realized then that it was the beginning of the end of her childhood, the end of her connection to her family, the end of everything that mattered. Amelia looked at the photo, her heart aching with the weight of all the things she had left behind. She had promised her father she would come back soon. She had promised him she would never forget where she came from. But life had a way of making promises feel like distant dreams. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet of the room settle over her. The silence of the house, the silence of her life was becoming too much to bear. She knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep living this way in the shadows, unseen and unheard. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would make a choice that would change everything. The days continued their relentless rhythm, each one blurring into the next like an endless monotonous hum. Amelia's routine had become as predictable as the rising sun. She woke before the world stirred, preparing the Pembrokes' breakfast, setting the table with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance. She carried out her duties, moving through the house like an invisible presence. The family members barely noticed her, consumed by their own lives, their own concerns. To them, she was not a person. She was simply a tool to be used, a shadow in the background. But something inside Amelia had begun to shift. The constant silence, the years of being overlooked, the harsh reality of serving a family that didn't care. It was all starting to take its toll. She had never allowed herself to show weakness, never let her exhaustion or her pain seep through. But now, as the months passed, the weight of her quiet suffering became unbearable. Her father's face haunted her in the quiet moments when the house was still, his voice echoing in her memory, reminding her that she was worth more than the life she had allowed herself to live. One evening, as the Pembrokes sat around the dinner table discussing their latest social events and making plans for the upcoming weekend, Amelia's phone buzzed in her apron pocket. It was a simple notification, a message from her sister, Evelyn. But the words on the screen stopped Amelia in Her tracks. Call me now, it's Papa. Her heart skipped a beat. She immediately excused herself from the dining room, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She slipped into the small, quiet service hallway, away from the family, and dialed her sister's number. The phone rang twice before Evelyn's voice, small and shaken, came through. "He's gone, Amelia," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible through the crackling line. "Papa. He passed away last night. I couldn't get to him in time. I'm so sorry." Amelia stood frozen, her mind unable to process the words. Her father, the man who had been her rock, the one constant in her life, was gone. Her knees buckled and she leaned against the cold wall, her hand clutching the phone as though it were the only thing keeping her from falling. "Are you sure?" Amelia managed to whisper, though she knew it was true. The disbelief in her voice was just a way of holding on to something, anything, to keep herself grounded. "I'm so sorry." Evelyn's voice broke again. "I called you so many times, but you were always busy. He went fast, Amelia. I don't know what to do." Amelia closed her eyes, the weight of her grief crashing over her like a tidal wave. This was the man who had raised her, who had given her everything, who had shown her what it meant to be strong in the face of adversity. And now he was gone. Gone, and she hadn't even been there to say goodbye. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Amelia whispered, though she knew it was impossible. The Pembrokes needed her. The house needed her. The gala, the guests, the schedules. They couldn't function without her. She had no right to leave, not now, not when everything depended on her. She hung up the phone, but her body remained frozen in place, as if rooted to the floor. The house around her felt suffocating. The grand halls, the polished floors, the cold, indifferent walls. They all seemed to close in on her, trapping her in a life she no longer wanted. She had always told herself that this was temporary, that one day she would have a chance to leave, to go back to her family, to rebuild her life. But that day had never come. And now, with her father gone, she realized that it might never come, at all. She returned to the dining room, her face a mask of composure, though her heart felt as if it had been ripped from her chest. The Pembrokes were still laughing and chatting, oblivious to the turmoil inside her. They hadn't even noticed her absence. She stood at the edge of the room, her hands shaking as she collected the empty plates from the table, moving silently, as always, like a shadow in the background. But as she reached the door, her movement stopped. Mrs. Pembroke's voice broke, through the noise of the room, sharp and cutting. "Amelia, make sure the silver is polished before the guests arrive tomorrow. We need everything to be perfect." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. It was as if the words had come from a distant place, a world far removed from the pain she was feeling. She stood there for a moment, her body rigid, before she slowly nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." But something inside her had changed. The suffocating weight of the Pembrokes' demands, the constant expectation to serve, to give without ever receiving anything in return. It was all too much now. Her father had passed away, and they couldn't even offer her the simple kindness of allowing her to grieve. They didn't see her, they didn't care. She was nothing more than a tool to them, a worker, a maid. They had taken everything from her, and now in her moment of loss they were demanding more. The words echoed in her mind. "I gave you 12 years, 12 years of my life, my work, my silence, and you still can't give me a single moment of peace." Amelia's chest tightened with anger, with frustration, with the unbearable weight of years of neglect. The tears she had fought so hard to hold back now threatened to spill over, but she didn't let them. She had no time for tears, no time for weakness. But she knew, deep down, that this was the breaking point. This was where it all ended. She couldn't go on like this. Not anymore. As she placed the last plate on the tray and turned to leave the room, she made a decision. Tomorrow would be different. She would leave this life behind. She would no longer be invisible, no longer silent. She would find her voice, and for the first time in 12 years, she would choose to live for herself. The Pembrokes had taken everything from her, but they would not take this final piece. Her dignity, her self-respect. They could never take that away. And with that, she walked out of the dining room, leaving behind the life she had known for so long. Tomorrow she would go to her father's funeral. She didn't know how, but she would find a way, and for the first time she would do it for herself. The morning came like any other. The house was still and silent, the faint hum of the world outside just beginning to stir. Amelia had woken up before the first rays of light, as she always did, but today something was different. There was an energy in the air, a sense of inevitability that she couldn't shake. The routine felt heavier, more suffocating, as though the walls of the Pembroke estate were pressing in on her from all sides. The grand chandelier in the hallway still glimmered faintly, its cold light casting long shadows across the polished floors. But today the house didn't seem as grand. The marble countertops, the antique silver, the rich carpets, they all felt distant, unimportant, as though they were part of a life she no longer recognized. As Amelia moved through the house, setting the table, preparing the breakfast, her mind wandered back to the phone call from her sister Evelyn. Her father was gone. She hadn't been there when he needed her, and now she would never get the chance to say goodbye. The weight of that thought hung over her, a constant reminder of how little her life had mattered in the grand scheme of things. The Pembrokes had never cared about her, not really. They had never seen her as anything other than a tool, someone to cook, clean, and serve. To them, she was invisible, a fixture in the background of their perfect, flawless world. The tears that had threatened to come last night had been swallowed down, buried deep within her. But today those tears wouldn't stay hidden. They burned behind her eyes, stinging like salt on an open wound. She stood at the kitchen counter, her hands moving automatically as she prepared the breakfast, but her mind was 1,000 miles away. She could hear her father's voice in her head as clear as if he were standing right beside her. "You're worth more than this, Amelia. Don't let them make you small. You have more to give than they'll ever know." Those words had been spoken to her when she was a child, a reminder that her worth wasn't tied to what others saw in her, but to what she saw in herself. She had believed them once. She had believed that she could leave this life, that she could carve out something of her own, something that mattered. But over the years, she had lost herself in the routines, in the never-ending cycle of serving others. She had forgotten who she was, forgotten what it meant to live for herself. But today, that changed. Amelia set the coffee pot down with a firm hand, her knuckles white against the porcelain handle. She looked around the kitchen, at the perfectly set table, at the silver trays and porcelain cups. It all felt so empty, so hollow. The Pembrokes would never appreciate her. They would never see her for who she truly was, and she had spent far too many years waiting for their recognition, for their approval. It was time to stop waiting. She had given 12 years of her life to this family, 12 years of her hands, her feet, her silence. And what had they given her in return? A life of servitude, a life in the shadows. It was time to step out of those shadows. Amelia finished setting the table, but instead of retreating to the background like she always did, she paused. She stood there, staring at the polished silverware, the gleaming crystal glasses, and the perfectly folded napkins. This time, the sight didn't bring her comfort. It didn't bring her peace. All it brought was a deep sense of suffocation. Without thinking, she turned on her heel and walked out of the room. She made her way down the long hall to the stairs that led up to the Pembrokes' private quarters. Each step felt heavier than the last, her feet dragging as if the weight of her decision was pressing down on her with every movement. But she couldn't go back. She couldn't keep living like this, suffocating in the silence of a life that was not her own. When she reached the top of the stairs, she stood for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house, the muffled footsteps of Mrs. Pembroke as she walked down the hall, the faint hum of a conversation between Belinda and Ashley in the next room. The family was awake, going about their usual business, unaware that Amelia's world was about to change forever. She could still hear Mrs. Pembroke's voice from the dining room, sharp and demanding as always. "Amelia, make sure the silver is polished. We can't afford any mistakes for the gala." The words echoed in her ears, but they no longer had power over her. The words that used to cut through her like a knife now felt hollow, empty. Amelia walked past the door of the dining room and into the servants' quarters where her small room awaited her. The room was plain, with only a cot, a nightstand, and a small window that let in a sliver of light. It was the only space that had ever been hers, but it had never truly felt like home. It had always been a place of exhaustion, a place where she collapsed after a long day of serving the Pembrokes, a place where she could rest her body but never her soul. She moved to the small dresser and opened the drawer, pulling out the old photograph of her father. The edges were frayed from years of handling, but the image was still clear. Her father holding her in his arms, both of them smiling, their faces full of joy. Amelia ran her fingers over the photograph, feeling the familiar warmth of his presence. The ache in her chest deepened, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to cry. Silent tears fell, tracing down her cheeks as she whispered into the stillness of the room. "I'm sorry, Papa," she murmured. "I should have been there. I should have said goodbye." But the tears weren't just for her father. They were for the life she had left behind, for the years she had spent in silence, for the person she had become, a shadow in a world that never saw her. She stood up, wiped her eyes, and took a deep breath. The time had come. She could no longer stay in this house, in this life. She had to leave. She had to honor the promise she made to herself all those years ago, to live a life that was truly her own. Amelia walked to the closet and pulled out her suitcase. She opened it and began to pack, folding her clothes with deliberate care. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but she knew that she could no longer stay here, trapped in a life that made her feel invisible. As she zipped the suitcase shut, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't the kind of calm that comes from knowing everything will be okay. It was a different kind of calm, one that came from finally accepting that it was time to let go. Time to walk away from the life she had built in the shadows and step into the light. The Pembrokes would never understand. They would never know what she had given up, what she had sacrificed. But that didn't matter anymore. Amelia was done being invisible. She was done being silent. She had a voice, and it was time to use it. With her suitcase in hand, Amelia stepped out of the room and into the corridor, ready to leave the only life she had known for 12 years. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of freedom. She wasn't running away. She was choosing to live for herself. Tomorrow would be the start of something new. And this time it would be her decision, her life, her voice. The house was still asleep when Amelia made her final decision. The sound of the clock ticking in the kitchen was the only noise breaking the silence. Each second passing slowly, deliberately, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the suitcase packed beside her. Each fold of clothing a symbolic gesture, an act of finality. She had never imagined this day would come. She had never thought she would leave the life she had known for so long, but now, the weight of her decision felt strangely light. Her mind raced as she reflected on everything she had endured. 12 years. 12 years of silencing herself, of bending to the will of a family that never saw her. 12 years of being invisible. And for what? For a few extra dollars, for the hollow promises of better days that never arrived? The harsh truth was that the Pembrokes had never seen her as anything other than an object, a means to an end. To them, she was just a maid, a tool that helped their lives run smoothly. But she was more than that. She was a person, with a heart that could break, with dreams and aspirations that deserved to be seen. She had spent so long trying to fill a role that wasn't hers, trying to please people who would never care for her the way she needed. And now, at the crossroads of her life, she had made her choice. She could no longer live for others. She could no longer sacrifice her happiness for the sake of a family that would never value her. Her thoughts returned to her father, the man who had always been there for her, who had believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. He had been the one to teach her that no matter how small the world tried to make her feel, she had worth. His voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of the promise she had made to him so many years ago. "You're worth more than this, Amelia. Don't let them make you small." The tears that had threatened to come for so long finally fell, but this time, they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to grieve. Not just for her father, but for the woman she had lost along the way. The woman who had once dreamed of something bigger, something more than just servitude. But now she had found her strength. She had found the courage to walk away. Amelia stood up, slowly, her body sore from years of hard work, but her spirit felt lighter, freer. She crossed the small room and moved toward the door. The house, the estate, everything she had known. It was all behind her now. She would never be the same. She would never go back to the woman she had been. The life she had lived was over, and though it was hard to let go, it was also the beginning of something new. Something that was hers. She walked down the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaking under her weight, each step a reminder of the years she had spent in silence. The air was thick with the familiar smells of the house, the polished wood, the faint hint of lemon oil from the daily cleaning. But today it felt different. The scent no longer comforted her. It suffocated her. She opened the door to the back porch and stepped out into the cold morning air. The quiet of the estate was now deafening. The world beyond the walls of the Pembroke estate was a mystery to her. For so many years, she had been trapped in this gilded cage, unable to escape. But now, she was free. Her heart raced as she crossed the yard. The cool grass beneath her feet, a sharp contrast to the polished marble floors she had spent so many years tending to. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light across the landscape. The world outside the estate was waking up, just as she was. She made her way to the back gate, the sound of her suitcase wheels scraping against the ground, the only noise that broke the silence. As she reached the gate, she stopped for a moment, glancing back at the house one last time. It seemed so distant now, so small compared to the weight she had carried for so long. The estate that had once been her world now felt like a prison she had outgrown. Amelia stepped through the gate and into the street beyond. The world was bustling with life, the streets already full of people going about their day. The city seemed so alive, so full of possibility. She felt like an outsider, but also for the first time, like she belonged. She wasn't invisible here. She wasn't just a shadow moving through the background. She was a part of something real, something alive. She flagged down a taxi, her heart pounding in her chest as she climbed into the back seat. She didn't know where she was going yet, but it didn't matter. For the first time in her life, the destination didn't matter. What mattered was that she was free. Free from the family that had never seen her. Free from the life that had kept her hidden in the shadows. She was ready to find herself again, to rebuild her life on her own terms. The ride to the train station felt like an eternity, but when the taxi finally pulled up, Amelia felt a wave of relief wash over her. She paid the driver and grabbed her suitcase, her fingers trembling as she made her way to the platform. The train was waiting, ready to take her away from this chapter of her life and into the unknown. As the train started moving, Amelia gazed out the window, watching the city fade away behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past was gone, and it was time to move forward. The journey was long, but it was hers. She had chosen it. She was no longer a maid, a shadow, a servant. She was Amelia, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The weight she had carried for so long had lifted, and in its place, there was a quiet strength she had never known she had. As the train chugged along the tracks, Amelia thought of her father. He had always told her that the world would try to make her small, but that she had the power to rise above it. He had been right, and now, she was ready to live that truth. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk, and for the first time in years she felt the excitement of a future that was truly her own.